Chapter 3 of A Lincoln Conscript by Homer Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Lover of Lincoln. There was an awkward pause. The band, already on its way toward the prisoner, halted. The man who had been pushing Bannister along loosened his hold. No one seemed quite ready to answer Miss Stark's question. At last the chairman of the meeting, feeling that the duty of acting as spokesman devolved properly upon him, replied, "The man is a traitor, Miss Stark. He is not fit to remain with us. It is for our own protection that we are sending him away." Sarah Jane Stark tossed her head scornfully. "Well," she said, "I don't see that any of you are in very great or immediate personal danger. And as for bravery, it don't take much courage for 50 men to set on one man and tie his hands behind his back and buffet and abuse him. I've watched the whole thing, and I don't like it. The man made a fool of himself, that's true, and Judge Morgan told him so. Now you're making fools of yourselves, and it's time someone told you so. I thought I'd be the one, that's all." "But, Miss Stark," persisted the chairman, "he's a copperhead. He's a defamer of the president and the country. He deserves no consideration, either from us or from you." "Yes," added one in the crowd, "and he's a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, and they plot treason and murder." Then Bannister found his voice for the first time in many minutes. "That's a lie," he said. "I'm not a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. I plot nothing. What I think, I say. What I do, I'm not ashamed of. What you cowards can do to me, I'm not afraid of." Sarah Jane Stark turned on him savagely. "You shut up," she commanded. "I'm doing the talking for this delegation." Then again she addressed the chairman of the meeting. "You ought to know," she said, "that I'm no copperhead. I detest 'em. You ought to know that with 2 brothers and a nephew in the Union armies, I have some sympathy with the soldiers. And if I ever loved a man in my life, I love Abe Lincoln. But there's nothing I love quite so much as I do fair play, and this isn't fair play." It was strange how quiet the crowd had become. But then, when Sarah Jane Stark had anything to say, people were always ready to listen. "Now the best thing for you people to do," she added, "the decent thing to do, is to loosen this man's hands, give him his coat and hat, and let him go quietly away to reflect on his monumental foolishness." She was already untying the handkerchief that bound Bannister's wrists together as she spoke. "Folly like his," she went on, "brings its own reward. Maybe the good Lord wants him for a Union soldier, and will supervise the draft to that end. So it isn't for you to fly in the face of Providence and spoil it all before the time is ripe. And you," giving Bannister a little push as she spoke, "you go home and get down on your knees and pray for common sense." No one else on earth, save possibly his own cherished wife, could have sealed Rhett Bannister's lips and started him homeward that day. But he had respect for Sarah Jane Stark. Along with his townsmen, he honored her motives, deferred to her judgment, and obeyed her commands. So, almost unconsciously, before he fairly knew what he was doing, before he had time to think whether he was retreating ignominiously from his enemies or leaving them in disgust, he found himself alone on the highway, walking toward his home. When he reached his house, he found his wife and children all waiting for him on the porch. Much as Bob liked music and crowds and excitement, he had not cared to go up to the village today, and had induced Louise to stay at home with him. And as for poor Mrs. Bannister, she shrank with dread from meeting any of her neighbors. The fact that something had happened to him during his 2 hours' absence, Bannister could not conceal. It was too evident from his appearance that he had been roughly treated. But neither of his children dared to ask him questions, and his wife contented herself with smoothing back his hair and rearranging his tie, knowing full well in her fluttering and fearful heart that vengeance had been meted out to him, and that sooner or later she would know the whole unhappy story. After supper, Bob set off some modest fireworks that he had purchased a few days before, 2 or 3 rockets, a dozen Roman candles, some pinwheels, and giant crackers. And so, as darkness descended, the Bannister family found some little consolation, some little relief from the nervous strain of the last few days, and the temporary pleasure of illuminated patriotism. Yet through it all there was anxiety and apprehension. wrought up by music and oratory and fireworks and news of victories, there was no telling what excesses the ultra-patriotic, irrepressible young people of the village might indulge in at the expense of a hated copperhead. Every noise from the direction of the town, every sound of hoof-beats on the highway, of footfalls on the side path, sent a thrill to the nerves and a chill to the heart of Mary Bannister. But as the evening wore on without incident, she began to feel a measure of relief. Then the gate latch clicked, and someone entered the yard and started up the path toward the house. But the suspense of uncertainty lasted only for a moment, for the heavy strokes of the cane on the walk, and the uncertain footsteps, announced the approach of their next neighbor to the east, Seth Mills. He was cordially greeted and invited to a seat on the porch. "I've just heard," he explained, "what happened uptown today, and I thought I'd come over and tell you." "Mary," said Bannister, "don't you think you had better take Louise up to bed? It's getting quite late. You may stay, Robert, if you wish." And when the woman and child had said good night and had gone, he turned to his visitor and continued, "Pardon me for interrupting you, Seth, but you see they don't know, and I thought it was hardly worth while to have their feelings worked up over it." Just so," responded the old man. "Protect the woman and children. That's what I say. But there wasn't much I wanted to tell you, Rhett, only that according to my views they didn't treat you right, and I'm sorry for it. They ought to be ashamed of themselves. Maybe they will be when they've had time to think it over. Me and you don't agree in politics, Rhett, nor about the war, but that ain't no reason why we shouldn't treat each other decent. That's what I say. And you were right about it, Seth, but I believe that you and I are the only two men in this community who could discuss their political differences without passion. You are of Kentucky ancestry. I am of South Carolinian. These other people here are either of the domineering Yankee type, or else are descended from the stubborn Pennsylvania settlers. Perhaps that accounts for their lack of fairness and reason. I've often wondered how Abraham Lincoln, with his Virginia ancestry, his Kentucky birth, and his Western training, could be so narrow, so illogical, so illiberal, so utterly heartless as he has shown himself to be. I don't think them are proper words, Rhett, to apply to Abraham Lincoln. I knowed him personally, back in Illinois. I've told you that 100 times, and I've studied him a good deal since then, and I've come to the conclusion that there ain't no man ever lived in this country who can see furder ahead and know better how to get there than Abe Lincoln. And I don't believe no other president, or king, or emperor for that matter, has ever felt on his heart a personal responsibility for his country as Abe Lincoln has felt it, or has strove or struggled or strained or labored or prayed as Abe Lincoln has, that his country might be saved and become great and happy. That's what I say. But, Seth, that's mere sentiment. Take the facts. Why can't he see, if he has such marvelous insight, that the South is demanding merely her rights? All she wants now is to be let alone, to take her property and go, to govern herself as she sees fit. And when she is assured that she may do so, this war will cease, peace will come, the horrible struggle will be at an end. Why does Abraham Lincoln persist in striving to compel this brave people, by force of arms, to pass again under the galling yoke of his hostile government? I'll tell you why, Rhett. It's because Abe Lincoln sees better than they do what's best for 'em. He sees that if the South was permitted to go and set up a separate government, and have her own institutions and flag and foreign ministers and all that, at the next thing, by cracky, the Western states want to gene up and do the same thing, with just as good reason, and then the New England states follow suit, and in less than 10 years there'd be a dozen different governments in place of the old United States, and they'd be everlastingly at each other's throats, and they wouldn't one of 'em amount to a hill of beans. It'd be rank folly. That's what I say. I know, but, Seth, it's not necessary to borrow trouble for the future. If this man would only do what is right and just in the present, the future would take care of itself. It always does. He claims that he wants to save the Union. Very well, there is a way open for him. The South is not anxious to leave the Union. If she were assured of the rights and consideration to which she is entitled, she would stay with us. Abraham Lincoln, by virtue of the power of his office, could secure those rights to her if he would. She must have some voice in the control of this government, as she is entitled to have by reason of her ancestry, her intelligence, and her patriotism. And she must have protection for her property at home and abroad, whether that property consists of land, money, or slaves. Give her these things, and she would be back with us at once. Oh, if Abraham Lincoln could only see this and act accordingly! If he would only cut loose from the radicals and the abolitionists and the petty politicians who control them, and who even now treat him behind his back with ridicule and contempt! If he would only heed the counsels of such men as Digham, Fernando Wood, Judge Woodward, and Judge Taney, patriots all of them, if he would even now sue for an honorable peace and strive for a united country, he would get it, and get it abundantly. But, alas, your Lincoln, with his assumed simplicity, his high-sounding phrases, and his crafty logic, is after all but a coward and a time-server, bending the country to his own selfish ends, plunging her into destruction in order that the bloody zealots at Washington may be satisfied. Oh, the folly, the misery, the tragedy of it all! The old man did not answer at once. He sat for a full minute, looking off to the faint line that marked the western hill range from the star-flecked sky. Over in the corner of the porch, the boy, who had listened intently, breathlessly, to the discussion, moved and drew nearer. From somewhere in the house came the faint music of a good-night song. Then Seth Mills, straightening up in his chair, took up again the thread of the conversation. "I don't see as it's any use for you and me to get argy about this, Rhett. We don't get no nearer together. We've each got our own opinions, and so far as I can see, we're likely to keep 'em. But you've called Abe Lincoln a coward. Now, I want to tell you something. I knowed Lincoln out there in New Salem when he was running Denton Offutt's store. I've told you that before, and I've told you how the Clary Grove boys come down one day to match Jack Armstrong against Lincoln in a wrestling match, and how, when Jack tried a foul, Abe got mad and catched him by the throat, and gave him the blamedest shaking up he ever had in his life. I didn't see that, but I know the story straight. And I've told ye how he straddled the log with a rope tied to it, and pushed it out into the Sangamon River at flood, that spring after the deep snow, and went tearing down with the current, and saved the lives of 3 men a-clinging to a tree-top in midstream, and come near a-losing his own life a-doing it. I seen him do that myself. And one night, when we was setting around the table at Offutt's store, swapping yarns, Jim Hannawell come in considerable the worse for liquor, and begun a-cussing and a-swearing like he usually did when he was drunk. And some woman come in to buy something, and Jim never stopped, and Lincoln says, 'Jim, that'll do. There's women here.' And Jim allowed he'd say what he blamed pleased, women or no women, and he did. And when the woman was gone, Lincoln come out around from behind the counter and says, 'Jim, somebody's got to give you a licking, and it might as well be me as anybody.' And he took him and chucked him outdoors, and throwed him into the mud in the road, and rubbed dog fennel in his mouth, till the feller yelled for mercy. I seen him do that too. Maybe I've told you all these things before, and maybe I ain't, but I never told you, nor no one else, what I'm going to tell you now. And I wouldn't tell you this if you hadn't a said Abe Lincoln was heartless and a coward. It was in that same winter of '32. I was out with the Clary Grove boys one night, and the liquor went round pretty free, and to make a long story short, I was laying in a snowbank alongside the road about midnight, half a mile from my cabin, dead drunk, and the weather around 0. And Abe Lincoln happened along that way and found me. It ain't a nice story, Rhett, so fur as I'm concerned, but I'm a-talking plain tonight. He wasn't under no obligation to me. I wasn't much count them days, anyway, but he turned me over and seen who I was and what the matter was, and then he twisted me up into his long back, Abe Lincoln did, and toted me that whole half-mile uphill, in 0 weather, to my home and my wife, God bless her. And he dropped me on the bed, and he says, 'Let him sleep it off, Miss Mills. He'll feel better in the morning. And when he wakes up, tell him Abe Lincoln asked him not to drink any more.' And I ain't, Red. I ain't tetched a drop of liquor since that night. But what I want to say is that the man had strength enough and heart enough to do that for me who was nothing to him, has got strength enough and heart enough and grit enough to carry this country that he loves on his bent shoulders through the awfulest storm that ever swept it, till he brings it home safe and sound and unbroken to all of us. It's a mighty task, Rhett Bannister, but he's a-going to do it. And I know him, and I tell you he's a-going to do it, and when he's done it, you and me and every man that loves his country, as he ought to, is going to get down on our knees and thank God that Abraham Lincoln ever lived." Clear and resonant on the night air, the old man's voice rang as he finished his story and rose to his feet. While his face could not be seen for the darkness, they who heard him felt that he was aglow with enthusiasm and love for the largest-minded, biggest-hearted man that had ever crossed his path, Abraham Lincoln. And Bob, leaning far forward in his chair, drinking in every word of the story, thrilled with the earnestness of the speaker, felt his heart fired anew with reverence and enthusiasm for the great war president, and with zeal for the cause which he had so faithfully espoused. Rhett Bannister was too much of a gentleman, and too deeply artistic in temperament, to try to break with argument or depreciation the force of the old man's recital. "Oh, well," he said, rising, "we all have our heroes. This would be a sad world if there were no heroes to worship. And I can't blame you, Seth, for having put a halo around Lincoln's head. Thank you, Rhett. Good night." The old man limped slowly down the path and out into the road, and turned his face toward home. After that, to those who sat upon the porch, the quiet of the windless, starlit summer night was unbroken. Over in the direction of the village, an occasional rocket flared up into the sky and fell back into darkness. Nothing more. But from that night the dominating personality in Bob Bannister's life was Abraham Lincoln. Look which way he would, the vision of that rugged, kindly face which he had seen so often pictured, and the tall, gaunt form, stood out ever before his eyes, heroic, paternal potential to the uttermost. From Seth Mills he obtained a small volume published in 1860, reciting the president's career, and from the same source he got what was much better, the modest, unique sketch of Lincoln's life, written by himself at about the same time for the same purpose. These books he read and reread many times, and the oftener he read them, the greater grew his admiration for the one great hero of his thought and life. In the meantime, under the Conscription Act of March 3, 1863, put in force by the proclamation of the President, the enrollment for the draft went on. In many of the states the drawings were made in July. On the 13th of that month began the draft riots in the city of New York, which were suppressed only after the destruction by the mob of much property, after the shedding of much blood and the loss of many lives. The country was deeply stirred. The anti-war party took advantage of the opportunity to denounce the government at Washington openly and bitterly. Only in communities where the sentiment was intensely patriotic was the policy of the draft upheld. Mount Hermon was one of these communities. Already partially depopulated by her voluntary contributions of men to the Union armies, she nevertheless accepted the situation philosophically and cheerfully, believing with Lincoln that this was the only practical way to put a speedy end to the war. But to Rhett Bannister this draft was the crowning act of infamy perpetrated by a tyrannical government. His whole nature rebelled against the idea of being compelled, on pain of death, to bear arms against his brothers of the South, whom he believed to be absolutely in the right. It was not until September, however, that the drawing for the congressional district in which he resided, the 11th of Pennsylvania, took place at Easton under the supervision of the provost marshal, Captain Samuel Yohe. It happened that on the afternoon of the last day of the drawing, Bob went up to the village to make some purchases and do some errands for his father. Since his unfortunate experience on Independence Day, Rhett Bannister had not often been seen among his neighbors. Aside from a few of the more radical sympathizers with the Southern cause, not many people sought him socially, and by the entire Union element he was practically ostracized. The condemnation visited on his father Bob could not wholly escape. While there were a few who knew of his own loyalty, There were many who knew only that he was the son of Rhett Bannister, the despised Copperhead. So in these days, when Bob went up to the village, he spent no time in loitering, or visiting, or playing with his former schoolfellows. His errands done, he started without delay on his way toward home. But on this September afternoon there was excitement at the village. For 2 successive days the names drawn from the wheel at Easton had included but a bare half-dozen from Mount Hermon, and these were the names of men who could well afford to pay the $300 demanded by the government as the price of their release from service. But today, the last day of the drawing, it was more than probable that the number of men drafted from Mount Hermon would be at least doubled. So, as the day wore on, the crowd about the door of the post office increased. At 5 o'clock, a special messenger would arrive from Carbon Creek with a list of the men that day drafted from Mount Hermon Township, the list having been sent by telegraph from Easton to that station. When finally the messenger arrived, Bob was listening with breathless interest to a discussion concerning the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was only when he heard someone shout, "Here's the list," that he realized what had happened. "Let Adam Johns read it," demanded a man in the crowd. Whereupon the young schoolmaster, mounting a chair and unfolding the paper placed in his hands, began to read, and the very first name that he read was his own. He looked out calmly over the group of men before him, his face paling somewhat with the shock of the news. "I will go," he said. "I ought to have gone before. I'm ashamed to have waited for this, but—" "You're all right, Adam," interrupted someone in the crowd, who knew how the schoolmaster's widowed mother leaned on him for comfort and support. "You're all right. There's a dozen of us here that'll be sons to her when you go." The young man wiped from his eyes the sudden moisture that dimmed his sight, and went on with the reading of the list. It was not a long one. There were some surprises, but there was no demonstration. For the most part the reading was greeted with a silence of intense earnestness, and the very last name on the list was the name of Rhett Bannister. The schoolmaster's hand, grasping the paper, fell to his side. For an instant no one spoke. Then a man shouted, "Hurrah for the draft!" and another one cried, "Uncle Sam's got him now!" And then, amid the confusion of voices, men were heard everywhere congratulating one another on the drafting of Rhett Bannister. With flushed face Bob started for the door, and the crowd parted to let him pass. But outside he ran into a group of his schoolmates, the same boys who had court-martialed him, and dismissed him in disgrace from their company 3 months before. "Old man got struck with lightning this time, didn't he, Bob?" called out Sam Powers. "He'll skedaddle for Pike County when he hears about it," added Briley. "Better run home and tell him, quick." "He don't dare to," responded Sam. "I'll dare you," he continued, shaking his forefinger in Bob's face, "to go home and tell your Copperhead dad he's drafted." "Aw, shucks!" exclaimed Bill Hinkle. "You fellows are smart, ain't you? Let him alone. He ain't done nothing to you. Oh, shucks!" And then Bob got angry. "It's none of you fellows' business," he said, "whether my father's drafted or not. You're bullies and cowards, the whole lot of you. Get out of my way." And so, with flashing eye, heaving breast, erect head, he passed through the crowd of boys untouched. Awed and silenced by his outburst of wrath, they dared not molest him. But as he went down the road, through the gathering twilight toward his home, he began to wonder if, after all, Sam Powers was not right. Would he dare to tell his father? End of chapter 3.